All right, everyone. This is Dr. Jenkins. This is your first video of a lecture to watch on your own. So remember, this is what's considered a reduced seat time course, and that means that we will only meet for lecture on Thursdays, and then you'll be responsible to watch the other quote-unquote lecture video on your own time. All right? Okay, so I know you can't see me, but the beauty of this is that I'm able to show you pictures such as what's in this PowerPoint, and then I'm able to also go through your notes. And the reason I use my iPad here is because I can write here, so I can fill in some of the notes for you, and I can point out what's most important, and who wants to see my ugly face anyway? Ha ha ha. Okay, so by this point, we will have met for our first Zoom call, because our first week of classes here this semester is online for our Thursday lecture. And in that lecture, we started chapter 2 on terminology and human motion. And I chose to do that with you because it's a little bit more detailed. This introduction part, I chose to record because it's a little bit simpler, and I figured easier for you to watch on your own. Okay, so remember, I have posted both the PowerPoint and the chapter outline. The chapter outline is what you should be focusing on because this really serves as your study guide, right? As you go through this, this shows everything that you're going to need to know for the exams. The PowerPoint sometimes has information you need to know, but a lot of times I use the PowerPoint just for examples that are used for illustrating points, but not that you actually have to know everything on there. Okay, my friends. Well, this course is called kinesiology. So, wouldn't we be remiss if we didn't actually define what on earth that means? Kinesiology is really an umbrella term, and you might see a lot of terms used to basically go along with kinesiology, particularly biomechanics is one. So what I want to point out here is that kinesiology is an umbrella term that encompasses many other things. If we were just going to define kinesiology as simply as we could, here's what I would say. The study of human movement. And you'll see it defined other ways, but this is the simplest, right? So in this course, we're really going to be talking about movement. And of course, when we talk about human movement, it can incorporate the biomechanics of joints. It can incorporate motor control, how our brain works with these joints. It can incorporate exercise physiology, etc. Now, I don't want you to be too scared. We're really just talking about human movement. And what a lot of this ends up being, so we're going to talk about 3 disciplines. What a lot of kinesiology, and let me see if I can zoom in here. What a lot of kinesiology ends up being is something you've already had: anatomy and physiology. So in order for us to understand movement, for example, we're going to be doing a chapter on each segment of the body. We'll do a chapter on the shoulder, on the elbow, on the wrist and hand, on the pelvis, on the hip, on the knee. Let's say, for example, the shoulder. Well, for the shoulder joint, we're going to start with the anatomy and physiology. In order for us to understand all of the movements, etc., capable at the shoulder joint, we first have to know the basics. And I know you've already had that. Yes, my friends, that is a prerequisite. I know you've already had it. My expectation is that you know it. So when we go through these lectures, I'll be reviewing some of the anatomy. If you remember it and know it, great. But if you don't, if you need to brush up, that's where you're going to want to spend time, because it is my expectation that you know the anatomy and physiology. And I mean, really, you don't want to be missing those easy points on the exams, right? So we're going to break down the study of human movement, or kinesiology, into 3 disciplines: anatomy and physiology. We'll take what you know and we'll bump it up, we'll kick it up a notch, as Emeril Lagasse used to say. And then we're going to add some of the mechanics, or biomechanics, because we are talking about the human body. But let me go back to the example of the shoulder. We'll be talking about the anatomy and physiology of it, and then we're going to be putting that to practice in the mechanics of a baseball throw, for example. Okay, so you should be reviewing everything that I'm talking about here, right? Okay, so we talked about kinesiology. We said that it's an umbrella term. Okay, this is also on your notes. Let's talk about kinesiology versus biomechanics. Now here, terminology does matter a little bit. So we remember that kinesiology is an umbrella term, the study of human movement. One thing within kinesiology is biomechanics. So while they're related, they're not exactly the same thing. Remember, kinesiology is the umbrella term, the study of human movement that incorporates a lot of other things. Biomechanics is a specific thing. So if I had to break it down, we would remind ourselves that kinesiology is the umbrella term, right? It's the umbrella term for describing human movement. One, two. You'll forgive me for writing it down and maybe repeating, but that just means that it's really important for you to know, right? And then we can talk about biomechanics. This is a subset of kinesiology, so it's under the umbrella. And if I was going to talk about biomechanics specifically, it's really the mechanics of movement, hence the name, mechanics of movement. And it tends to be more quantitative. And we know what that means, right? Make sure I spell it right. Quantitative. Quantitative means we assign a value. We assign a number. So what are some examples of things that we'll be talking about with biomechanics? We're going to be measuring quantitative things, such as force, such as acceleration, such as torque. So make sure you could kind of separate these out a little bit, right? We will be spending a lot of time on the biomechanics, right? And that's kind of the specific measurement of motion, more of a quantitative measurement. We assign a value to it, like force, acceleration, torque. And that's a part of the umbrella term for the study of all of human movement. When we talk about the study of human movement, this can kind of overall, it's more qualitative. So if we're talking about the overall study of human movement, the umbrella term, overall, we're being a little bit more qualitative, which means more descriptive. So what are some examples of a more and we'll be discussing this later, so I'll save my breath, but we'll be talking about joint position, flex, extend. We'll talk about types of motion, curvilinear, rectilinear. We'll be talking about what a baseball pitch looks like. Well, there's this first phase, the cocking back, then there's the acceleratory phase, then there's the deceleration phase, and then the follow-through. But you can see I'm introducing some important terms here. How can I really, let's go with, what color can I use to really, let's do blue. Yes. So the umbrella term kinesiology was more qualitative, and the subset of biomechanics was more quantitative. Good. Okay, so we talked about kinesiology. We talked about it's an umbrella term that can incorporate biomechanics. We talked about kinesiology versus a specific subset of biomechanics. We talked about the 3 specific disciplines that we'll be focusing on in our study of human movement or kinesiology: anatomy, physiology, and mechanics. Aren't you excited? Ha, ha, ha. So most of you in this class, I know not all, but most of you, many of you, are physical education majors. In my experience, I haven't talked to you yet at the time of this recording, but in my experience, we also get some pre-health professionals, like pre-PT, pre-OT. No matter if you're going into physical education as an educator or a coach, no matter if you're going into become a physical therapist, an occupational therapist, a physician assistant, really, this is going to apply to all of you. Right? And if we were meeting in person, I would ask you, well, how is it applicable? Right? But I'm going to let you think about that on your own. But I think we can know that kinesiology, particularly the study of human movement, I'll just give you a simple example. The study of human movement is important as a physical educator. Isn't that a lot of the focus of your job? Teaching motor skills, teaching skills of sports and activities. Well, in order to teach someone how to properly hit a volleyball or how to properly, depending on what age you're teaching, in order to teach someone to properly shoot a free throw, you have to understand the human movement. How far should the elbow be bent, etc. So I think we understand that. Be able to give some examples that relate to your own field. Hint, hint, hint. Okay, so we did that. Okay, you'll see in your notes, there's this thing called the C principle. I know this is kind of dry. Believe me, things are going to get much more exciting later on. All right. The C principle, this comes from the phys ed world, but when we talk about the study of human movement, we have 3 important, what word do I want to use here? 3 important, I guess I can just say things, but 3 important focuses. That sounds better. 3 important focuses of kinesiology. So we know what kinesiology is, the study of human movement. But within that, particularly if you're going to be a phys ed teacher, or even if you're going to be a physical therapist, occupational therapist, we have the C principle. We're really focusing on the safety of that movement. Think about if you're a physical therapist. You want to be able to teach someone the human movement, reteach them the human movement of getting up out of a chair after a stroke. You have to be able to teach them that movement safely. If you're doing phys ed and you're talking about a certain skill, talking about throwing a football or throwing a baseball or softball, safety is important. We got to make sure that we're teaching the human motion properly so they don't throw the ball at someone's head. So safety is important. That's the S in C. We want people to be effective in their human motions. So if we're teaching a skill like the sit to stand for a physical therapist or occupational therapist, not only do we want them to be able to complete that activity safely, but effectively, because once we know that someone can safely and effectively do the sit to stand, we know that they may be able to live on their own. Talk about being a physical education teacher. You're teaching someone how to throw a free throw in basketball. Well, in addition to being safe, we also want them to make the basket. So we're teaching skills that allow them to be effective. And as we get higher in our teaching levels or physical therapy levels efficiency. Not only do we want people to be safe when they do it, be effective in how they do that human motion, but ultimately efficient. We don't want people to overuse the wrong muscles in a certain motion that lead to an injury or that lead to them not doing it efficiently, and maybe it could lead them to tire out more quickly than they otherwise would. So no matter what field you're going into, these really are important. And I know it's kind of baked in the sauce of what you're going to be going into your career for, but I think it really is worthwhile to just break it down, because this is what we'll be doing. Okay. So you can see here why we're here, because we want to be able to understand and teach and work with the study of human movement in a safe way, an effective way, and an efficient way. And there's a bunch of other reasons, right? I don't really need to list them. Hopefully you can think of some examples on your own of why it's important to understand human movement and make it safe, effective, and efficient. Better performance on the athletic field, reduced risk of injury, better ability to perform activities of daily living. I think we can go through those, right? Now, here's where I'm going to go to the PowerPoint and just give some things for fun, right? This is where I like to make things fun. Now, I understand that I'm older than you, and therefore some of my references are older, but really it's still applicable today. So this is Jennie Finch, former softball pitching great, and this is Albert Pujols. I think he's still playing with the Dodgers. Is he with the Dodgers? Anyway, years ago they got together, and Albert Pujols could not, a Major League Baseball hitter, one of the best hitters in the game at the time, could not hit a fastball by Jennie Finch. Well, why is that, right? So here's a fun example of how understanding kinesiology and the study of human movement helps us to understand these really cool things. Well, here's a reason why. And this example, I have to give a reference, came from a really fascinating book called The Sports Gene by David Epstein. Okay. So Jennie Finch in softball is pitching from 43 feet away from the plate, which is different from a Major League Baseball pitcher. So she's closer. Albert Pujols is used to watching a ball come in from farther away. So even though Finch's pitch was only 60 miles per hour, because it was traveling over a shorter distance, it was really the equivalent of the 95 mile per hour fastball. But it was more than that, right? So even though it's the equivalent of a 95, you might think, Albert Pujols, he can hit a 95 mile per hour fastball. So it's not just doing some math. Why would it be different? Usually if we're meeting in person, I pause for drama. It's called a dramatic pause. Some interesting things here that we've learned through our study of kinesiology. And again, this is not going to be on any test. It's just interesting. It's interesting. Hand-eye coordination, it can be improved up to a certain point, right? So even the best athletes don't necessarily have a better hand-eye coordination up to a certain... Of course, they're probably a little bit better than the couch potato, but there's an anatomical limit, right? This is about the anatomical limit. It takes time for the eyeballs to bring in that sensory information, for that visual information to travel through the eyeball, through the optic nerve to the right part, to the correct part of the brain, which is the occipital lobe, right? And then in order for us to carry out a motor response, nerve impulses have to travel from the occipital lobe of the brain, where sensory visual is received, to the primary motor cortex in the frontal region of the brain, which then will initiate a motor response, which has to go through the cerebellum to help process it. Then it goes out to the body, the muscles that will create the movement. All these things take time. So hand-eye coordination isn't the only answer. It can only be so fast because of anatomy. And look at the average reaction time. And it takes this much time from the ball to get from the pitcher's hand to the catcher's mitt. So if Albert Pujols is trying to identify the pitch and then try and hit it, it takes half. It takes half of the whole time from that ball to get from the pitcher's hand to the catcher's mitt. It takes half of that just to recognize the ball, which basically means that when it's all is said and done, a baseball player, or for that matter, a softball player, at bat has about 5 milliseconds once they initiate the swing of the bat to coordinate the bat with the path of the ball. And why couldn't Albert Pujols hit Jenny Finch's softball fastball? Well, with those 5 milliseconds, he got pretty good at doing it in a baseball. But maybe you've been thinking about this. A baseball pitcher is coming from an overhead motion, whereas a softball player is coming from an underhand motion. So the reason why Albert Pujols can hit a Major League Baseball pitcher is because he's learned over time how to better predict the path of the ball. So within those 5 milliseconds, he's gathered whatever data he can, but the rest of his ability to make that bat hit the ball is prediction. He's seen so many baseball pitches coming overhead, coming at a certain angle, release with a certain spin. Well, Jenny's pitch is coming from a different angle, different ball, different spin, so he doesn't have any experience predicting it. That's the answer. I know. Okay, other things that we'll talk about this semester. I'm really just trying to also get you excited about this. Here's Albert Pujols again. We're going to be spending some time talking about lever systems. Don't be afraid. Don't go anywhere. I'm going to break it down for you. Don't go. Well, lever systems are the explanation why a batter might choke up when he's behind in the count, or he may have his regular grip when he's ahead of the count, right? In which case can he hit the ball farther, choked up or regular grip? When he's choked up, he can hit the ball farther when he's not choked up. That's because the distance between the effort and the load is greater. When he's choked up, the effort and the load is smaller. This is going to make more sense to you when we get to it. Which class lever system is this? Well, it's a third class lever. You don't need to know this now, but we're going to be talking about it later. Other examples of how we're going to be able to utilize kinesiology in our understanding of human movement in sports examples. I tend to use sports because it's easier for me. How about a goalie, a soccer goalie? In which instance, top or bottom, has the goalie positioned him or herself in a way that makes it harder for the striker to score? Well, obviously this one, right? If the goalie comes up to meet, he's lowering the vector, the available vectors that allow the striker to get the ball on the goal. So we'll talk about vectors. Oh, yeah. We'll talk about all sorts of things. We'll talk about the joints, like I said. Here's an ACL tear. Oh, man. Females are much more likely to have ACL tears. We'll talk about why. Maybe you already know some of the things. Women have a higher Q angle, therefore more valgus force, a smaller base of support. Women also have a narrower intracondylar notch, usually weaker muscle support around. All these things play a role. We'll talk about correct form, whether it's lifting or picking up a box if you're an occupational therapist working with a factory worker. Of course, this squat form is correct. You want the knees to be over the toes, not over them in terms of your knees are bent too much and your weight is too far ahead of you. But this way we have a wider base of support, a lower center of gravity. We decrease the valgus force, and we allow other muscles to be utilized, like the glutes and the back. Similar idea here, and we'll talk about that. Folks, there's just so many examples. You know, I don't know why more people don't love this course. Hopefully, you'll learn to love it. If not, you'll learn what you need to do to get a decent grade, and then you'll move on and do whatever it is you're passionate about. So those were all examples of why we're here and all the fun we're going to have, especially in lab. Okay, let's talk about how we study motion. And here we're going to get into qualitative and quantitative. Here we go. Qualitative versus quantitative. We already talked about quantitative involves objective measures. So it's objective, which means we're going to assign a value. Assign numbers specifically. It's objective. How high did someone jump? We can measure that in inches. How far did someone throw a ball? We can measure it in feet. How fast did someone sprint 100 meters? We can measure that in time. What angle should the elbow be flexed to during a free throw? We can measure that in degrees. Qualitative tends to be more of a subjective assessment. Subjective means that it's a non-numeric descriptor. Right? So we could use terms like flexed, these are examples, or rotated, or good versus poor. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that one is better than the other. You know, I think when you first hear about this, you're like, oh, well, objective is better because there's less room for error. Well, that's true. If I measure something with a stopwatch, I can be pretty consistent and accurate. So it's true. Some of the positives of the quantitative is that there's more accuracy, less room for error. You can better measure progress. If I have a really objective, quantifiable number, I can really measure progress well. But it does have limitations. Sometimes there's things that you just can't put to a number. So some of the negatives of quantitative is that it doesn't allow for, how can I say this? Doesn't allow for a full description. You know, what's an example here? An example would be fielding a ground ball in baseball or softball. You can talk about how far your feet should be apart. You can talk about a quantitative measure of how many degrees the knee should be bent. But what is something that is qualitative in teaching someone how to field a ground ball is that you should have a soft and loose, soft glove and arms. Meaning you don't want to have really rigid, tight hands. You want to basically have soft hands and allow the ball to kind of come to you instead of being a rigid hand that it's going to bounce off of. So quantitative sometimes doesn't allow for that, right? Qualitative sometimes gets a bad rap because qualitative may not be as accurate. Sometimes there is more room for error because you're just using descriptors, right? But there are some positives. It allows for better description. Something also that's a positive about qualitative is that you can get more feedback from someone. And what I mean by that is from person doing activity. I'm a cyclist, used to be a triathlete, but my knees kind of crap the bed. So, nowadays in cycling, we have these power meters, which are like a force pedal, and I get the exact wattage of how hard I'm pressing on the pedals. And that's a really useful quantitative value. So my peak watt was maybe 600 watts during that sprint, right? But that doesn't tell me all the information. It doesn't talk about my form when I'm pedaling. One of the things that a coach told me once was, you really should punch your toe forward when you're coming up and around the pedal stroke, but then when you come back, it should feel like you're trying to wipe gum off the bottom of your shoe. So in other words, after you go forcefully forward in the pedal stroke, when you come back, you want to actually pull up on the pedal. So you're not just putting force while you push forward, you're pulling back with force. And the imagery of wiping gum off the bottom of my shoe, that's a qualitative descriptor that really helps. So you can get feedback from someone. You can say, what did it feel like when you were doing that back part of the pedal stroke? So, okay, you get my drift, right? Both are useful. We rely on both. Good. So there's other ways to describe motion, but in our first understanding of this, in our first understanding of how we can study human movement, kinesiology, we can do so qualitatively or quantitatively. We can use a laboratory study, or we can just use an everyday observation. Okay? Same idea. There's obviously pluses and minuses to both. What are some positives of a laboratory study? Well, accuracy, validity, reproducibility. I'm using big words. But what are some negatives of laboratory studies? Cost, takes money, often takes time, space, expertise in utilizing equipment, right? Sometimes everyday observations can be helpful, right? What are the positives of this? Free, easy. What are some negatives? May not be as accurate. So similar to our discussion of qualitative versus quantitative, there's a place in our world for both, right? All right, let's go through the PowerPoint here. So I've given some examples here. This is more for you if you want to practice. We did talk about qualitative versus quantitative. So in a long jump, the quantitative could be how long someone jumped, the amount of degrees the knees were flexed. Qualitative might be how aerodynamic their form was through the air, how their weight was distributed over their legs. I mean, so many examples here, right? Quantitative here, the amount of torque generated at the shoulder and the elbow during the cocking and deceleration phase. Quantitative, the distance in inches of the stride during the pitch. Qualitative, we could talk about, of course, all the examples I'm thinking of first are quantitative, but we could talk about qualitative, where this pitcher had his eyes focusing during the motion, right? Qualitative, the amount of rotation, just visual rotation at the trunk. All sorts of things like that. And we can use it in everyday examples too, right? All right, so we're going to, in our example here of how we can study motion, of course we can do a laboratory study. This is obviously better in a lot of ways, but it's not the only way. And then we talked about everyday observations. Well, in a laboratory study, make sure you review the steps of the scientific method. Okay? I'm not going to go through them all. Well, I guess we will. I was looking in the notes to see if they were there. So just make sure you review this, and you might see them be called different things, but the basic steps are the same. So the first thing you have to do in the scientific method is observation, and I think sometimes people forget about that. The way that we come up with ideas to do a scientific method study is we observe things in the world. And then from our observations in the world, we develop a question, a research question. And then we develop a hypothesis. So we think of a broad question, and then we think, well, how are we going to study it? What's our hypothesis going to be? Then you create your study design. You carry out study. Gather data, analyze. And hey, some scientific method studies are qualitative. You can do a survey study. So it doesn't always have to be quantitative, although in kinesiology, a lot of times it is quantitative. Gather data and analyze. And then, of course, what's our last thing going to be? Compare results to hypothesis to see if our original hypothesis was shown to be true or not. And we know why we use the scientific method. If we're doing a scientific study, we have to follow some basic rules to make sure that we're doing a study that has accuracy, validity, and is reproducible. So if someone else does it, they get the same results, and that means that the results are accurate. Have a basic idea of the scientific method steps. You may choose a different words for some of these, but of course the idea is the same. Okay. Examples in kinesiology. So we just went over the steps of the scientific method. And the beauty of this video is that you can pause it or rewind if you needed to write those down. And so be able to give some examples of how we could study kinesiology using a scientific method. We could analyze form like a biomechanical analysis. So it's not necessarily just the form of the golf swing, but it's also the materials of the golf club and how that has changed. Here's some interesting things. Used to be wood, then it was steel. We're talking about the golf clubs. Then it was carbon fiber, and now a lot of them are titanium. Light but strong, but not so rigid that there's no bend in it. Now we have a longer shaft of a golf club, larger head, and more flex. Again, these specifics are not going to be on a test. I'm just giving you some examples. As we've updated not only the human motion of the golf swing, but also the materials, we've also seen a sharp increase in the length of the drives, even since the 80s. And folks, I was alive in the 80s. I was alive in the 70s. Oh dear. So you can see on your notes here, analyze form, or you utilize new equipment. Right? We can also do a joint analysis. Other biomechanical advances. Oh, I'm ahead of myself here. That was at the very end. Okay. We could do a joint analysis. All right. Just be able to give some examples. But we could also do everyday observations. And we're actually going to be doing a lot of these everyday observations in our lab this semester. We are restricted in the time that we have and the resources that we have. There's really no way you can do a scientific study in an hour and a half or 2 hours. So we're going to be doing some everyday observations that will incorporate some quantitative assessment. And sometimes this has a place. So we'll be talking about ways in which someone can maintain the proper form. Sometimes trial and error is utilized. Okay. Page 2 of the notes here. Usually when you're doing some kind of laboratory study or even an everyday observation, we will use some tools. You don't need to know all these tools. We're going to be using some of these in lab, like goniometers and our manual muscle tester. Not only are tools used for measurement of quantitative data on the person's movement, but we can also get some data from the person, some psychological data from them. All sorts of fun stuff. And then this end here, I'm not going to ask you these on a test. It's just kind of fun. You know, we can utilize kinesiology in a whole bunch of things. So I'm a cyclist, as I said. You know, back in the day, your Tour de France cyclists used to smoke cigarettes. Look at that picture, right? They thought that it opened up their lungs. Crazy, isn't it? They used to not really have any gears. Back in the day, no gears at all. Here is an example from the 70s, right? And we can see the gear shifter is right there on the down tube there. You talk about triathlete positioning or time trial positioning versus a road bike position. Again, this is just an example. Why is it that triathletes want to be more bent over? Well, it's more aerodynamic. And because there's no drafting, that matters. By having their trunk bent to a greater degree, it shortens their quads, and it allows this cyclist to utilize more of their glutes, and it saves the quads for the run. All sorts of fun stuff. Okay, everyone. This is your first video. It's a shorter one. It's an easier one. This is how the style is going to be for the rest of the semester for these online videos. As always, I'm here if you have questions. You can ask me when we meet for a lecture on Thursdays or for lab. You can request a Zoom session, just me and you. You can email me, whatever you need, folks. All right, I'll see you soon.